Who starts?
So I'm going to start. I'm just going to give
right.
some time for the participants to join.
Perfect. Okay.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
All right, I think we can get started. So, welcome everyone. Good morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are. So welcome to today's webinar. This is part of the Young Scholar webinar series on climate change, macroeconomics, and finance, organized by the E-Access Forum. So today we've got a great speaker lined up for you. So we're going to have Julian. He will present his paper with Florian Heeb, where they've developed a novel field experiment in collaboration with an equity index provider to study the impact of shareholder engagement on firms' environmental performance. So just to sort of introduce Julian a little bit, he's an assistant professor of sustainable finance at the University of St. Gallen, School of Finance and Center for Financial Services Innovation. He's also affiliated with MIT Sloan and the Swiss Finance Institute. And his research covers the real-world impact of sustainable investing and analysis of ESG metrics and investor preferences for sustainability. Just to sort of also give his quick educational background, so he studied at ETH Zurich and University of Oxford, and along with his very impressive academic work, he also serves on the investment committee of the Swiss Pension Fund. And so with that, and without any further ado, I'm just going to hand it over to Julian. And Julian, you're going to have roughly about 45 minutes to do your talk. And what we are going to do is we're going to do the questions in the end, and I'm going to direct them to you once you sort of finish. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to you.
Super. Thank you so much, Ishita, for the warm welcome and introduction. Hello, everyone. I'm Julian, and it's a real pleasure to be on this seminar in a great lineup of very interesting papers. So very happy to be here. Yep, 40 minutes. I think that should do this paper, The Impact of Climate Engagement, a field experiment. What I really like about it is it's a really easy paper. So there was quite a bit of involvement in setting it all up, but now that is done, it's not so hard to present, and I think also to understand what we did. But I'm looking forward to all your questions, of course, at the end. So I always like to give away sort of the key thing right at the beginning, and this is sort of the one slide summary of the paper. So it's about engagement, and we want to know if engagement works. So the most straightforward way to figure out if it works is to run an experiment and just, pick a group of companies that randomly get the engagement treatment and keeping a control group that doesn't. And the engagement request was that firms commit on the Science Based Targets Initiative homepage to set a science-based target. So that's what we call SBT commitment. And you see on the left-hand side the fraction of firms that have an SBT commitment, starting from around 0 over that 1 year that we ran the experiment. And you just see that the red line, the ones who had the engagement treatment, have a higher incidence of SBT commitments than the black line. And I'll show you a test, and this is a significant difference, but basically that's what we did, and that's what happened. Okay, So let me walk you through this step by step. Why did we do this? I think, and you heard it in my bio, that sort of the key question in sustainable finance, I think, is, well, what is the impact on the real economy? This is what I'm curious about. And investor engagement is already considered perhaps one of the more or most promising channels to do that. So there's a theory paper by Elena Procardo and Oliver Hart and Luigi Zingales who sort of argues that case. We also have already quite a bit of evidence that's relying on observational data where asset managers provided data sets about whom they did engagement with and what happened as a consequence. But there is one problem with the empirical evidence so far, and that's a concern potentially about selection bias. So if you get a data set from an asset manager and said, well, we engaged firm X and we asked them to do Y, and 2 years later they actually did that, and then that looks like a success and an impact. But it's possible that asset managers are simply good at picking out firms and especially asking them for things that they know are underway already. So maybe they've talked to someone at the firm and they know they're going to set probably a climate target, and then it's a great time to ask them to set a climate target. And so there's a certain interest, I think, to do that also in if you want to show to your clients that you're being effective. So that's a concern. I'm not saying it's the case, but that is potentially a concern. So I think that's the launching point for this project is like, well, let's do it in an experimental way where we actually randomize the engagement treatment, and then we can rule this out. Another special twist, I think, is that in this case, it's index provider engagement, and that comes with a sort of slightly different setting than perhaps the more classical case where an asset manager who runs mutual funds does engagement directly with their investees. So here it's an index provider, and the starting point is that there is a threat of exit by index rule. So this index has rules, and it is modeled. This cryptic abbreviation here is European Union Paris-aligned benchmark, climate transition benchmark. So there's regulation by the European Union that prescribes how these two kinds of indices ought to look like. So this index provider that we worked with, they had a family of indices that followed that regulation. And there are a bunch of rules, but one of the rules is if you don't have an SBT, and that stands for science-based target commitment, then there's an annual weight reduction in the weight that a constituent has in the index, and it will go to 0 by 2025. And if you don't have a verified target, there's also an annual weight reduction, which is the verified target is the next step. I should clarify that. So first you commit, and then you have some time to submit to SBTI your plan, and then they verify that as a proper climate target. And they also show that on their homepage. If you don't have that, you're at 0 by 2030. So that's a very explicit threat of exit from the index. Yeah, but it's explicit, there's a rule, and it's pretty clear what will happen. So in the control group, they know this rule, or at least they could know this rule. This is public. They can view the index rule and see what's the deal. In the treatment group, the difference is that they get a letter, and they sort of, in the letter, they cite the threat of exit. So these rules outlined above, and encourage the company to sort of take the first step and file a commitment to set a science-based target. So in a way to think about it, you can think that the treatment or the engagement is a reminder about an existing threat of exit. That is really the treatment. How does that look like? So it's a letter from the index provider's CEO to the company's chairman, so at a relatively high level with a signature and everything. The provider has chosen to remain anonymous, so it is somewhere hidden in our pre-registration, but they didn't want to be associated with the paper. The ask was, otherwise I could have shown you the letter originally, so now I can't, unfortunately. But the ask is, well, commit to set a science-based targets, and specifically with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So there's a homepage where companies can submit their commitments, And also researchers can actually download the list of companies, which comes in handy. So we have sort of an independent repository of what's the outcome. They mentioned the threat of exit in the letter. And they also mentioned that the index provider itself is actually just in the process of setting itself a target. So they kind of, make sure we wouldn't ask of you what we wouldn't do to ourselves. And that's here you got the treatment period. That's basically the year of 2022. And the experiment was pre-registered, and here's the link. Now the outcome is strictly based on the data from the Science-Based Targets Initiative. So that's, I would say, the go-to repository right now, and lots of ESG data providers also base, if they have a score, such as does the company have a target, they sort of go to that database and get the raw data. So unfortunately, currently they have a bit of governance issues there, but in principle, I'm a huge fan because they actually make this public. They update it every month, and anybody can download it. So we kept downloading those Excel sheets, and it's a public registry. Nobody needs to pay for it. It's pretty transparent, and importantly, it's independent of us. It's independent of the index provider, right? We don't have to rely on some data that they give us. We can sort of observe it directly from there. And the company, in order to commit to a target, they have to send a letter to Science-Based Targets Initiative. We clarified that from the start, so we count both. There are two different statuses: target set and committed. So both of them we will count as a success. So outcome 1. And if the company is just simply not in the registry, then the outcome is unsuccessful. That means they basically didn't reach out at all to SBTI. While we ran the experiment, they actually changed that. If a company commits and does not follow through with a target eventually, they are kept in the database as commitment removed. And that happens 2 years after the initial commitment. But so as we did the baseline, that was irrelevant. That didn't exist as we did the baseline. So here, just to give some color to that, this is an example of a science-based target from TUI Group. That's a German-based travel company. They have hotels, they have cruise ships, they have some airline business. And you see on the right-hand side what they say on their homepage. So they say by 2030, they will reduce airline emissions by minus 24%. They also say that this target has been validated by the Science-Based Targets Initiative. And this is the text that you would get from their database. So here they also say, TUI commits to reduce Scope 1 and Scope 3 well-to-wake emissions from jet fuel 24% per revenue passenger kilometer by full year 2030 from a full year 2019 base. Okay, so you could squibble a little bit. They didn't say here that it's per passenger kilometer. This could look like an absolute target. But nonetheless, at least the numbers they check out. So they write on their homepage also, the number that they put here. This is actually someone who committed during our treatment period. They weren't in the treatment group though, and afterwards they had their target verified. Is this relevant? If you think about that, the company as a whole, 2021, they had about 7 million tons of CO2 equivalents of emissions. So it's quite a bit. If they reduce that by 24, 27%, those are millions of tons, which is, if you think 51 billion is the annual global emissions. So, it's something. It's a big company with quite a bit of emissions. If they were to follow through, that's what I'm saying, that would be a relevant reduction. Sampling. So the target population was 1,227 international corporations. It's an international sample. We started from roughly 2,000 firms that were just constituents in any of the climate-related indices that the provider had as of a cutoff date in late 2021. And then first we took out all the companies that already had a science-based target or a commitment before the treatment started. So in the baseline, of course, we had to remove them. We also decided to remove companies that were under active engagement by Climate 100 Plus. That is a pretty big investor club with trillions of assets under management behind it that essentially makes the same request. So we felt an additional letter, from an index provider wouldn't have a big effect here. So we would rather have it outside of the experiment. We excluded them by design. And then the random assignment was done in a blocked random assignment. So one concern we had is that there may be, and that's actually based on prior literature. So there's a paper by Patrick Bolton and Marcin Kasperczyk called Firm Commitments, where they sort of look at which companies actually sign up to SBTI. And they find significant country effects. And it's easy to see that perhaps a French company would be more willing or more prone to sign up to set a science-based climate target than perhaps a US-based company. So what we didn't want to have is just, by random fluctuation, have a bunch of French companies in the control group. So we blocked within company, so that means we draw the appropriate number of companies within each country. So to make sure we have a balanced sample within country in all those 27 countries that were in the sample. We implemented that with R. If you care to see it, I have later in the appendix a table that shows you that kind of across countries, it's very well balanced, and across sectors, because we didn't block there, it's a bit less balanced. Okay, well, and this is the result. So it's a simple contingency table with SBT, no and yes, and control and treatment. The sum in the treatment group is those 300 that we randomized, 927 was in the control group. And it's easiest to see if you just take the fraction, because they are not the same size. And the fraction that has SBT yes is 15.7% in the control and 21% in the treatment. So they both obviously over time increased their signups, but it was higher in the treatment group. And if you do a chi-square test, very easy here, you find that this is a significant result. So it's a significant difference. In terms of total numbers, it's 63 companies out of 300 who eventually committed during that period. So one robustness check, if you will, is to do the same not with it. This chi-square is what we pre-registered, but you can also do a probit and say, well, the outcome is 0, 1. We run a probit regression where the treatment is one of the regressors. And then that comes out if that's the only regressor. And then we can also include the blocking variable as a regressor, so the country fixed effects or NACE sector fixed effects. And we can also put in size, total emissions, and emission intensity as potential drivers of SBT commitment. What's sort of in principle, we randomized, so this all should be irrelevant, but it's reassuring just to see that the effect remains significant. It actually sort of increases slightly in effect size as we add these different controls. So yeah, I think that's just reassuring to see that the result holds in a probit model with controls. Essentially, that's saying it doesn't look like something went wrong during the randomization. Something that we were curious about is whether maybe the treatment effect is accruing, especially in subgroups. And particularly, we were worried that it might be the case that companies for whom it is easy to sign up to something like that, because they don't have a lot of emissions to start with, or they're easy to abate sectors, that they would sign up and basically make up the bulk of our treatment effect, whereas the companies for whom issuing such a commitment is actually a big deal, they don't, and then that would be slightly misleading, the global treatment effect. So we look at median sample splits. We split the sample at the median in terms of size, total emissions, and emission intensity. And we actually do find the treatment effect in the upper half of the sample in each of those three cases. So I think we can say, well, also for companies with large climate externalities, we see that treatment effect. It is not, however, so the interaction term, I think for emission intensity, it is sort of weakly significant, and the 10% level, you could say, well, even emission intense companies are a little bit more likely to set a target, but it's at the 10% level. Another thing was, deviating from the pre-registration, we were interested whether there's a difference between commitment versus target set. And that, I mean, the reason why we bunched it together was initially because we don't know. They might commit and then get their target set a few months later. So we wanted to streamline that. But if we split it up, we can see that most of the action comes from commitments. So that's the red part of the bar. And they actually, the verified targets are more or less the same between control and treatment. And that makes sense if you think that, they allow for 24 months to follow up with the target. Realistically, if you ask in February, please commit to this initiative, it's feasible within a couple of months to get the okay from, the CEO to send this commitment letter, but to actually come up with a plan how you will reach those targets and then get it verified by SBTi is probably tight within 1 year. So I think it makes sense that we see most of it coming from commitments. Obviously, we are just waiting until the 24 months have passed to do a follow-up analysis and see, well, what happens now? So do we see the same treatment effect actually also in targets that are actually set? Oh, I think I'm going way too fast, but that means we have more time for discussion, so maybe that's good. I think the implications are that, this very concrete case, financial institution, in this case an index provider, they requested a public commitment to a net zero target and communicated a threat of exit for non-compliance. So if you sort of pair these two things, you will request something that's kind of limited, you sign up to this initiative, and you say, well, and if you don't, actually there's consequences in terms of our index in this case, then we see that causes additional commitments that probably otherwise would not have happened. I think it also provides a blueprint for investors who are interested in demonstrating their impact, and that's for legal purposes interesting in certain jurisdictions because you're not really allowed to use the word impact anymore if you can't back it up. So I think with an experiment like that, you're probably, you have a good case to say, well, we tested it and we do have an impact. We think we can make 4 contributions. One is straightforward on the empirical literature on engagement. We don't contradict actually the results of the prior literature. They all have found in varying degrees the effectiveness of engagement, but I think we add an important point that we can have a greater confidence in this causal effect. If we think about the empirical literature on ESG screen, sort of the carbon premium or other sort of, where the assumption is that there are asset managers, asset owners, mutual funds who screen companies on certain ESG criteria, ESG ratings as well. Basically, there's a bit this discussion in the literature, is it exit that really matters? Is it voice? But I think what we see here is that it's the threat of exit that really drives firm behavior. And that's actually an old idea. That's really what matters. So I think we can add to this, and that comes with the implication that financial institution that already has an ESG screen in place might actually be, if they want to have an impact, might be well advised to simply inform companies about the fact that it's there, and especially inform those companies who are kind of close to the threshold. Because we cannot assume currently that corporations are completely aware of all the index rules, all the investment rules that a variety of mutual funds and asset owners will have, because there's a lot of them. So being explicit about that, I think, is important. We can also say something about corporate governance by index exclusion, excuse me. So that's kind of a corporate governance topic where, in the absence of SEC regulation or other financial regulations, there is the idea that index providers have actually the power to enforce, certain rules that are implicit in their index rules. So if you construct the index such and such, then the idea is that companies might comply with that in the absence of a legal rule. It's viewed kind of rather critically in the corporate governance field because that gives index providers even more power. But we show here a case that this actually might work in the case of this, like setting a science-based climate target, which is a climate policy thing, but here we see some evidence that it works. We also see our experiment a little bit in the line of, the impact of sustainable finance beyond microfinance. So there have been these field experiments have been run a lot in the area of microfinance, thinking what are the effects of financial inclusion? But financial inclusion is kind of a small market compared to the sustainable investing market. So we are happy to sort of run a field experiment about the impact of this more mainstream sustainable finance and sort of add to that debate. So in terms of future research and some limitations, I think an obvious next question is to see, well, what are the knock-on effects of these SBT commitments? Right. I mean, so essentially what the company needs to do, they need to, send a letter to SBTI that is signed by someone responsible of the organization that says, yes, we are going to set ourselves a science-based target. It's a small step. I mean, that in and of itself doesn't reduce emissions, probably doesn't get us anywhere. So at this point, we just wait. We want to look at carbon emissions, but it takes a long time actually until you get even the reports from you get now probably the results for the year 2022. So it's still early days, but we're definitely interested in looking into that. Might be also interesting to sort of think about Climate Action 100 plus. They already have done a lot of engagements in the past and sort of estimate what their combined effect might have been based on the results we have now. There are some papers we relate to nicely. So Lakshmi Narayanan has a nice paper also on shareholder engagement where they actually show that it results in tangible emission reductions. They do that with the New York State Comptroller. So that's something to pad our result, which is just a commitment to set a target. But we say, well, there's potential knock-on effects down the road. Bolton and Kasperczyk have a paper that suggests that carbon reductions so far have been small from the companies that have set targets. So that's another relevant point to our results. And then there's a paper by Bruno Bier and Augustin Landier, who suggest these commitments maybe rather than reducing the carbon emissions of the firms themselves, they just sort of also have a feedback effect on the likelihood of future regulation, because it makes easier for policymakers actually to regulate on climate change if they basically have the backing of industry setting targets and saying, yes, we can do this. Well, with that, I think I'm kind of at the end of my presentation. I have a few backup slides, but I don't want to extend it more than necessary. I see there are a couple of questions in the chat, so I'll hand it back and start the discussion. Thank you so much.
Well, great. Thanks so much, Julian. That was fantastic. And I think there are many questions in the Q&A. But before we get to them, let me ask a couple of mine, and then I am...
All right. Okay, sure.
I am going to start with the stuff on the Q&A. So one of the things that I was wondering is if you could just say a little bit more about what is the incentive of the index provider itself, and could it be, I mean, is it even credible, their threat to actually throw someone off the index? Have they actually ever done it? Or is it simply like cheap talk? So I'd be very curious to know a little bit more about the index itself. And if it's a size-based index, what sort of thing are we talking about? So that's one. The second, you sort of already alluded to a little bit. So a skeptic might say, given all of the greenwashing literature that we have sort of already seen, right, that the commitment doesn't really translate into any actual real actions. And so I understand that you cannot possibly look at some of the long-term stuff, but are there other balance sheet characteristics that you can already evaluate that would give you some sense of whether the firms that actually commit are moving in the right direction? So maybe if you could sort of get started with them, and then I'm going to start asking other stuff from the Q&A.
Yes, with pleasure. Great questions. So let me talk a bit about the index provider and how that works, and then sort of potential sort of knock-on effects, how we could see them. The incentive for the index provider when we started was, I think, that there were people inside the organization who understood that it would be valuable to demonstrate the impact of what they do in an experiment. So that started the whole thing. And I think the incentive was at that point the hope that that would work out, and that could be used as as a talking point for marketing and actually just building the case for these indices. So I think they saw it as a business development opportunity. Have they kicked people off the index? Yes, of course. So these are index rules. I think they could, in theory, be changed, but as far as a credible threat of exit goes, that's probably as good as it gets. Because changing index rules when push comes to shove looks super bad. And I think, so yes, they have done that for all kinds of other reasons, right? If your liquidity, sort of the free float drops below a certain margin, then you also fly out of the index. So it's nothing out of the ordinary. Yeah, perhaps something that is also worth mentioning in that context. So it is actually a little bit unclear how much money is tied to that particular index. So there are very few ETFs that build directly on those indices. But there are large asset owners who use the index to benchmark their own investments. But it's, they don't commit to follow the index 100%, of course. So I would say also on the side of the corporations, there's a little bit of uncertainty of how relevant is this? And in that sense, it's nice that we did find something. Otherwise, that would be really, really hard to say what's going on. To your second question, so I completely agree, right? Committing to set a target, so people already sort of are pretty critical often of those targets, and this is just a commitment to a target. So, is this moving the needle? Yeah, I admit I don't know. So we need a lot more than that to really make a dent. I think at the moment it's a matter of time. So the nice thing is we have identification now through this letter campaign, and now we just wait and look at other variables. I mean, we could look at. So I'm actually pretty skeptical that to see big effects on carbon emissions and also on sort of capital expenditure. So that's just in my view, that's just not how corporations roll. Is that they change their capex plans due to investor engagement. So I'm a little bit skeptical that we would see that. I think well we'll look at it when the time comes. I think it's also important to. So I think that engagement of investors can play a role in making these things go a little faster, happen a little sooner, but it's not enough, certainly. I think this is a case where you can say, well, at least it's not complete greenwashing. I mean, they did something and something did happen. Whether that something is then enough in the bigger scheme of things, that's sort of, I see the challenge, but I would also play it back to some extent is that, so far there's very few things that we truly know that will solve the problem, except perhaps geoengineering and also there. So it's a game of uncertainties. And here we have a little bit on, so, there's this trade-off. We know now a little bit more about maybe a small thing, and there are bigger actions that we might take about which we perhaps know less. That's my reaction to that. But I mean, the challenge, I'm keenly aware of it.
Ishita, I think you're on mute. You might want to repeat.
I think she.
Yes.
I was just wondering where you were. Yes. Okay.
Awesome. No, thanks so much. That was super helpful. Let me ask a couple of questions from the chat. So Steve is asking a couple of very interesting questions. So one is whether anyone's actually monitoring the change in what happens after you commit, if anyone's actually monitoring a firm's behavior. And the other question is this whole debate about exit versus voice. And so obviously that's a big question in the literature, whether it is more effective to disinvest from a polluting firm, or it's better to sort of hold the equity and use ownership to influence the firm's behavior. So do your results sort of point towards one of them being better than the other?
Yeah, super good questions. Thank you, Steve. And thanks for relaying them. I actually didn't see them. So is anyone monitoring? So anyone in the sense that, yes, SBTI is monitoring if you have committed and you didn't follow up with a sensible target that they verified as, as in accordance with their criteria, and their criteria are okay, strict. Then you are now listed as commitment removed. And I think I checked this morning, there are 360 companies who now have commitment removed. I saw, so airlines, for example, at the moment, they have a hard time having verified commitments because they decided that carbon compensation is not allowed. And as an airline, currently, there's just no way you get to zero without some degree of compensation. So there is a bunch of checking going on by SBTI itself. And I encourage everyone to just look at that data. I think that's a really great resource that we have. And you see the changes. If you need old vintages, happy to give them to you. I download this every month. The second question on exit and voice. So I think what this shows, this is a combination of exit and voice. And I think the idea that you have to do one or the other is a little bit, it's true to some extent, but it's not entirely true. So the most effective way, or what comes out here, is a combination that we have a threat of exit, and they say, well, but then they combine it with voice and say, listen, this is how we rule. This is how we invest. This is our rule. And they basically make it contingent. They say, look, every year your weight is going down a little bit until you're out of this index. Unless you do exactly this, I tell you exactly what you need to do. You need to write a letter to this SBTI homepage and commit. And you have to have a verified target at this and this date. So it's like super explicit. So, and I think that combination of exit and voice is powerful because, of course, the criticism of divesting is, well, then you divest and then others have control who are potentially less, interested in the climate. And then, ultimately you're, it's counterproductive. Well, that's because after you've done your Wall Street walk, you're irrelevant. You sort of have to make your demands before that. I think that's kind of obvious, really. But the limitation of voice only is that, there are the situations where, the asset manager picks up the phone and calls the company and they say, we have to talk about the climate. And they talk about the climate for 1 hour and then they both hang up and they're like, yes, we talked about the climate, and nothing absolutely happens because the company knows they are hugging the index. They're never going to sell anyways. So then also, why should they do anything? So I think it's interesting to talk about the combination of voice and exit rather than just the dichotomy, should you do this or that?
Yep, that's super helpful, Julian. There's a bunch of questions on sort of the robustness of the results. So let me just sort of combine 3 or 4 of them in one and ask away. So basically, Christina, Nicholas, Enrico, they're all asking about the influence of sectors, really. So is it the case that, you see some of these results sort of coming out from a particular sector, or even like the country of incorporation? And I think there would be some interest in sort of seeing the results by sector. So maybe that's something that you can sort of try to do in the next version of the paper. And I had a related, sort of not exactly related question. So is there a reason why you're sort of not doing traditional diff and diff here? Sort of looking at after the letter sent out, whether you're more likely to commit versus before, so sort of tracking the same firm over time instead of just looking at treatment versus control.
Good question. Let me just, I accidentally finished the presentation and it disappeared. So let me share it again. So the question around, so unfortunately, I don't have tables showing sort of the value of the fixed effects, right? We ran regression with fixed effects, both in countries and sectors. And here you see that, all countries are represented, sectors as well. I think what I can show is, it's a probit regression. So we should maybe have some sort of pseudo R squared, but you see the log likelihood. So the fit, it gets better when adding these fixed effects, but not super dramatically. So I think actually those effects aren't very strong. But it's a good idea to sort of disclose the full, there might be some of them that are significant, and maybe you'll see my example with France. I would be reassured if French companies do it more than others. That's true. Why not a classic diff and diff? I'm not sure. Would we gain anything? I mean, I haven't really thought about it. We could certainly do it. But I think here we have the advantage that we have already a control group. The control group is the control group. We don't need to, exploit that difference in difference. Is normally something, I suppose, when, anyways, I will think about it. It throws me off track.
No worries at all. So let me sort of ask a couple of more related questions, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know the name of the person who's asking this, but okay. So basically, I think the question really is, why do we see any effects in the control group? Because if this threat sort of already exists, if, given that the index is public, you would expect to get kicked out no matter what, right? So why is this letter in particular, you think, sort of acting as a trigger?
So I think this points to the fact that currently in the market, there are gazillions of rules, ESG-wise, that, indices, asset owners, asset managers invest by. And of course, they are in principle, I mean, they are public, but that doesn't mean that each and every CFO is aware of this. So I think there is kind of an information friction. So sometimes in models, right, we assume, there's a share lambda of green investors and they only invest companies over this threshold, and all companies know where that threshold is. And then they optimize and see, okay, let's invest a little bit more in green. And then so we make the threshold. That's kind of how we think about it in terms of models. But I think in reality, it's much more messy, right? We have all different ESG ratings, and companies are wondering which is the ESG rating that counts. and how much money is behind that. And if we have a good grade, do investors even actually trade on that? So there's a lot of uncertainty. So in that sense, that letter, I think the difference that it makes is it gives them one very concrete point where they say, well, this is the schedule. Currently, we're on track to be excluded of that index. And then they can make up it makes it easy basically for them, right? They can make up their mind, well, is it worth doing that versus dropping out of the index? And then they do it. So I think that's sort of just really easy for corporations to handle. I think that's why the letter has an effect. I think there was a sub question why we also see action in the control group, and that's obviously because this index provider is by far not the only one who asks for SBT commitments, right? There's many investors who will ask for that. There's just a general trend of companies doing that. So the control group, the black line, obviously reflects the general trend.
Great. And related to that, in fact, there was a question on whether it might be confusing for firms, given that different index providers sort of provide different targets. Let me turn to some of the questions that our PhD student panelists are asking. And guys, if you can just unmute yourself and ask, maybe Olympia, you can start, and then I'm going to come to the others subsequently.
Hello. Thank you so
Hello.
much. So thanks for the presentation. So I wanted to ask, what's the relationship between this SBT targets and, for example, CDP targets, given that there's some quite recent research, I would say January 24, Yang, Kim, and Lu, that show that a lot of firms don't meet their CDP goals. Those that committed to meet their emission reduction goals in 2020, and that there is virtually no stock market reaction to this, like missed, let's say.
Yeah.
So yeah, thanks.
I don't think I've seen the paper, but that sounds concerning, right? That even though companies miss their targets, then the market doesn't care. That sends a signal that they didn't in the first place. I mean, I'm keenly aware of that. Is the problem is that the targets are all set for 2030 and 2050. Those are the two horizons over which you set targets. So it is just hard at this point in time to say if they will reach the target. I mean, I agree that it's bad if you sort of keep increasing emissions until 2029, and then magically within 1 year you'll come down of it. So that's it looks bad, but so I would have to look at the paper, how they do that right now already. Also, given that
they use 2020. Yeah, they use some firms, something like 1,000 firms have 2020 goals, so they look into that, and a lot of them didn't reach them. That's how they do it. But a lot of firms have much farther goals, in time.
So I think my response is that sounds concerning, and we have to be careful, right? These are just targets and commitments with zero legal standing. So the only disciplining forces will be A, the market, and B, some sort of customer reputation or something like that. And if those two things don't pull, then we probably shouldn't think all that much of these targets. I agree. The one statement I heard from a person working inside a big corporation. So I asked, well, will you actually stick to the target? And they said, well, that depends on what everybody else is doing. And I think that's the spirit in which many of those targets are done. They say basically, in principle, if the world moves, on that trajectory, I'm going to be part of it, but I'm not going to be the only fool. So, yeah.
Like they're not gonna disinvest from everyone. So a bit betting
well, so
on
if it's
that.
a financial, well, exactly. If it's a financial institution, if you want to, it's hard to have a net zero portfolio in a world that's not net zero. I mean, you're really constrained. But also then this was a corporate who was, in a sort of in the real economy. And they said, well, we're ready to go these steps, and we have our costing, we know what we're going to do. but we're not going to suffer while all our competitors are just, not doing the same thing, right? So if that turns out to be the case, then, we'll forget about our targets.
Great.
Thanks.
Should we move to someone else, maybe? Alyssa, I'm gonna maybe, okay, why don't you go ahead and then I'm gonna.
Sure. So
Alyssa
Julian,
is so ready.
Yes.
No. So I just wanted to come back to the earlier discussion that we had, or that the answer that you gave, Julian, on that actually you can combine divestment, voice and the divestment. And I wanted to point out that there's a paper by Martin Kasperjak, actually Patrick Bolton and Frederick Samama, called Net Zero Portfolios. And then there's a follow-up paper by Martin Kasperjak called Carbon Transition Risk and Net Zero Portfolios. And so in the first paper, they do something very similar, and I think it will be relevant to compare to your study. So they essentially propose a net zero version of the S&P 500 index, where initially the constituents of that net zero version of the index have the exact, so that net zero index has the exact same constituents and weights as the normal S&P 500 index. But then over time, the index that is net zero decarbonizes according to a sort of a carbon budget aligned, if you like, science-based target pathway. So companies know when they will be divested if they do not decarbonize, and specifically that is the companies that are in the S&P 500. So there's indeed an opportunity for investors in the S&P 500 net zero index to engage, to try to get them to decarbonize so that they will not be divested. But if they do not decarbonize, then there is a date where they will be kicked out. So it's a combination of divestment and voice. And as Frederick Samama would say, it's one of the first, like the one that you're mentioning, assets that actually implicitly captures the cost of delay, right? It captures the time urgency of the carbon budget. And then there's this follow-up paper by Martin Kasperjak, which I mentioned, called Carbon Transition Risk and Net Zero Portfolios, where Martin Kasperjak actually shows that the distance to exit, which is sort of how many years you would be divested if you do not decarbonize, is actually priced into capital markets, and there is some carbon premium related to that. And I guess the one big question is, are these net zero or these indices that would divest you if you're not decarbonizing big enough, right? And for example, the S&P 500 is something like 12 trillion. The net zero version is only, I think by now, like 10 billion. But then there's a paper which is also relevant, I think, to mention in your literature review, which is called Voice Through Divestment by Marco Becht.
Yeah.
And that even if there's no actual divestment or not really big size, still it may have a sort of, how do you say it, like a stigma or something effect that may have a bigger impact through reputation and so on and so forth. But in my view, at least, if more investors would actually invest in this net zero index so that it would become bigger compared to the S&P 500, so it would reach closer to trillions, actually it could really make a big difference. So I guess I'm just mentioning these papers because I think they're very tightly connected to what you're studying. And I think it will be very helpful to compare what they have done to what you're studying. And so it's really a remark, but also curious to hear, I guess, your thoughts on these papers and what I mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. I think they all sound very much related, and I think I know the time to exit paper. The others, I'm not sure. So if you could send me the references, I would be very happy to double check. Yeah, that would be nice if a carbon-free version of the S&P 500 would become as big as the current S&P 500. I think it's not likely to happen anytime soon. But I agree, that would be very powerful. What I think is nice about this index is that there's always a credibility problem, for everybody who says net zero, people kind of look at that and say like, yeah, well, let's see. Even when it comes from a government, right? If a government says So Switzerland has ratified the Paris Agreement, and basically Switzerland is saying, yes, we're going to be net zero by 2050. And people are like, well, we'll see whether you're really willing to inflict the economic pain on us to actually follow through with that. And they, everybody knows they won't if it's too costly. And I think it's the same for everyone. So rules that are in place that are difficult to change are always, I think, helpful, at least on the margin.
Exactly. And I think,
Alyssa, sorry to interrupt you. Let me get one more question in.
Yeah.
So, Julian, as you can tell, there's lots of interest here, and I'm sure some of these people would like to follow up with you later. I cannot possibly ask all of the remaining questions, but one last question, and I think, Thea, if you want to go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Sounds
Thank
good.
you so much. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Hi, Thea.
Perfect. Hi. Thank you so much for the presentation. Super interesting. I have one question regarding the sectors that's been raised earlier. I've seen that in your sample you have around 20% of financial institutions in the treatment and the control group, and I was wondering whether the criteria for the sector-specific SBTs change, and whether that makes it potentially easier for financial firms to commit to these SBTs. Could you comment on that?
So whether the changes in the rules from the SBTI?
So
Yeah.
I saw that there are different sector-specific targets or commitments that you can do. And since this is a large group in your sample, how could that drive potentially the results?
Okay. It's a fair question, right? So the different sectors have, the calculation whether they should commit or not is very different depending on which sector you're in. That's correct. I'm not particularly worried about this driving the results because this pertains, equally in the control and treatment group. And as you say, there are financial firms in both. I don't know if they have a high rate of SBT commitments or low, right off the top of my head. But as suggested, I think we should probably include that in the appendix so people can, because that's obviously interesting. I agree. Whether maybe, both in the treatment and the control group, a lot of commitments were given by, for example, the financial industry. I don't think so. We also control for sectors in the regression. So I don't think it will be the case that somehow all or many of the SBT commitments in the treatment group happen to be from the financial industry. I don't think we would see that. But we should disclose that more transparently. I completely agree. Thank you, Thea.
Thank you so much.
Great. I just wanted to acknowledge that many other people asked questions in the chat. And Jeza, Finn, Michaela, I'm sorry, and I'm missing a few names, of course. So I'm sorry, could not get to your questions. As you can see, even though Julian sort of finished early, and I'm glad you did because there's so much interest in this stuff. Since we are completely out of time, let me just thank you for doing this. Really a big thank you, very interesting paper and an equally interesting presentation. And really grateful to you for taking out the time.
Super. Well, let me also thank you very much for having me in this series. Really a great opportunity for me to share this paper that I'm quite excited about. Maybe you can tell. So just quick hi to Michaela, who is going to start a PhD with me in fall. Good that you're on the call. It's nice to see you here, and we can take it offline, of course, and everybody else as well. So you're just welcome to reach out if you want to discuss anything else or want to know more. I'd be more than happy to link up. Please do reach out. And thank you, Ishita and Alisa, for inviting me.
Of course. Well, thanks everyone for joining. It was really nice and loved all the energy. I just wanted to mention our next webinar takes place on Monday, June 3rd. Where Diksha Gupta is going to present her paper called Dynamic Green Disclosure Requirements. So please sign up. And again, thanks so much for joining today. Have a great day.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Julian, I posted.
Oh, hey.
the chat.
now we're back here. I see.
Yes.
We're back
Okay.
here. Guys, I have to run, but Julian, really, really interesting paper.
Thank you, Ishita.
Super,
Thank
yes.
you so much.
Yes,
you,
of course.
Ishita,
Take care.
Frederick.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
I'll
Bye-bye.
be in Boston in summer. I might reach out in
Oh,
July.
absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
if you're
Yeah,
around.
sure,
Cool.
absolutely. See each other
Take
soon.
care. Bye.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye. Julian, I posted the papers in the chat. If you want to
Perfect.
but so basically the first paper is called Net Zero Carbon Portfolio Alignment. That's the paper that proposes the sort of net zero version of an index. And let me say they have actually implemented it, right? So Frederick Samama is at S&P 500 and they created this index. And importantly, actually, the index outperformed the S&P 500 index. It has a small tracking error, and it keeps like similar industry weights. And then the follow-up papers are by Marcin Kasperjak, which is called Carbon Transition Risk and Net Zero Portfolios, where he actually showed that this distance to exit, which is sort of the distance to divestment if they would not engage with decarbonization, that's priced. And then there's this paper by Marco Becht on voice through divestment.
Yeah, that one I know. I mean, we cite that one. So that's
And then there's this a recent paper which actually got presented here by Perry Sestri, showing that the net zero.
Yeah, I saw that the other day on LinkedIn. That's a really depressing paper.
Yeah. So, but the point is, right? I think what is beautiful about this idea of the net zero portfolio is that, you know, it's one thing, as you say, to say, okay, I'm signing up to a net zero index, but it's another thing to say, actually, this has my signing up to net zero has implications for how I invest, right? And so the net zero version of the index is basically a combination of saying, hey, I'm net zero, I'm committing to net zero, but not only in words, but in action, because my investments are going to align with net zero. So I think this is a super powerful idea. And I haven't fully read your paper that you presented today, so I'm not fully sure like how you can relate it, but it seems like very relevant to what you've done, and definitely papers that you might want to cite in your work.
Super. Yeah, it is super related, and thanks for sharing those. The paper, I mean, it's a very short read, really. And if you've listened today, you probably don't have to read it anymore. There's really not more in the paper than I presented.
I'll try to just to make sure I fully understood everything. But
share it. That would be appreciated. We have not been super successful with conferences so far, to my chagrin. Maybe people think the paper is too short and thus not good. I don't know how they judge.
Happy to try to promote it.
That would be lovely.
Yeah, these are really relevant papers to the debate also of combining divestment and voice, because it's not or, as you say, it's not or.
Yeah, it's like, even if you read, so I actually did read this. There's the book by Albert Hirschman or something like that, 1970, Exit and Voice.
Oh, okay.
I mean, there's a original, and he's very clear that, you know, basically he's talking about things like decisions, you know, if your country descends into an autocracy, you have voice and exit. Either you immigrate or you get involved.
Yes.
Right? But those are big choices. And then it kind of doesn't make sense to, you know, immigrate right away. You might as well,
exactly.
You know, or in a relationship, right?
Yes, exactly.
Voice before exit.
Exactly.
Everybody gets that.
Exactly. But it's not really understood in the finance literature yet. Right? So
I know. In finance, they like to keep things simple, but sometimes too simple, maybe.
I know, but that's why I like you as an academic thinker, Julian. Anyways, I hope these papers are useful for you. And
they are, absolutely.
Yeah.
I also should see that the kids get some food tonight, so I have to sign off. But let me thank you
Julian,
once again.
Thank you very, very much on behalf of the forum, and we'll be in touch again just to follow up on some other logistics.
Sounds great.
Such as the slides or something like that?
Yeah, the slides, adding the slides. We will also put up the recording of the webinar. Yeah. And I just want your permission that we can use the slides as well. So once we've
You
done
have
that.
my
then
permission for everything.
Fantastic. That's great.
But I'm happy to
Okay.
confirm in writing in case you need that. No
No,
problem.
no,
Yeah.
it's fine. I just, you know,
Okay.
since you have to go, I didn't want to keep you any longer.
No, no, I
Okay.
mean it's not that they're not starving yet, but I sort of, you know, I should slowly go there. So so should I send the slides? Maybe if you could drop me an email so that just I don't forget, because I will run off now and then
from the ones you sent me yesterday.
Marginal. It's just very important that you don't use the initial version. So because there was a mistake, but the ones I sent yesterday, you are fine to use. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. Fantastic. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much. Alyssa, thank you as well, as always.
Yes, of course.
And I'll see you both soon. Thanks so
All
much.
right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Take care.